They say if you listen closely inside the old courthouse of St. Landry Parish, you can still hear it, her scream, buried beneath 100 years of paint and prayer. It isn't a sound that travels through air. It moves through bone. It crawls up the spine of anyone who dares to stand where the light first turned red that day in 1853. No record keeps her name. No sermon mentions her sin, but every brick seems to remember. Every nail remembers the smell of blood mixed with magnolia. The summer was so hot that year, the air itself felt alive. The cane fields shimmered, the horizon trembled like it wanted to flee. Yet inside the courthouse, time stood still. Men in linen coats sat with their hands folded, pretending not to notice the tremor in their own legs. The trial was supposed to be quick. Another example made, another whisper silenced. But something in her voice refused to die neatly. She wasn't supposed to speak. She wasn't supposed to know words like contract or inheritance. But when she rose from the defendant's chair, her chains clinking like tiny bells of defiance, the entire room forgot how to breathe. She said there was an agreement, that her master had promised her freedom, not out of mercy, but out of fear, because she knew what he did in the field chapel at night, when the lanterns burned blue and the soil itself seemed to move. The judge tried to drown her in laughter. The jury turned their faces away, but one man, couldn't. The clerk, young, pale, trembling. He wrote every word she spoke, even as the sheriff's hand hovered over his pistol. By the time dawn broke, the girl was gone, the transcript vanished, and the clerk's house was found empty, door wide open, pages scattered like feathers in a storm. What did she know? What secret was worth erasing an entire life for? The answer never left Louisiana. It sank into the river, carried by those who understood that silence could be a form of worship and a weapon. But every generation someone hears her scream again and wonders whether the past was buried or simply waiting. The morning after the courthouse emptied, the boy's absence was treated like dust, noticed but not spoken of. They said he'd run north, maybe joined the fever camps, maybe drowned in the bayou. No one cared to check. But down by the river, a fisherman found something that didn't belong to water. A page, half dissolved, written in ink that hadn't faded like normal ink. The words clung to the paper as if alive, as if unwilling to let go of their meaning. Only one line could still be read. He feared the ones beneath. Weeks later, that same fisherman vanished too. The clerk's name was Thomas Vale, a quiet boy. Father was a printer, mother a schoolteacher. He had a habit of writing everything twice, once for the court and once for himself. That's how they found it, hidden behind the cracked plaster of his rented room decades later when the building was torn down. A second journal, bound in leather, marked only with the symbol of an eye without a pupil. Inside, pages of cramped, terrified handwriting describing things no court should ever hear. He claimed that during the girl's testimony, the candles in the courthouse began to flicker even though the windows were sealed, that her shadow didn't move with her body, that when she said her master's name, it came out in a language no one recognized, but everyone understood. The entries get stranger. Thomas writes of nights spent awake, hearing voices under the floorboards whispering his name, of dreams where the courthouse stood in ruins, yet he was still recording every word of trials that had no end. He began sketching symbols, diagrams of the plantation chapel, circles, lines, faces without eyes, and one sentence repeated again and again, scrawled so deep it tore the page. She didn't belong to him, he belonged to her. By the final entry, the handwriting changes, jagged, rushed. It reads, "I heard her again tonight. She said the contract was not with man, but with the land. And the land remembers." No one knows where his body went, but the journal, what little survived, was sealed in the archives of St. Landry until 1911. Then, without explanation, the box was emptied, the tag removed, and the curator resigned the next day, claiming she'd seen the girl in the reflection of the glass. By 1853, the plantation was more than just a stretch of sugarcane and swamp. It was an organism. It breathed through the marsh, whispered through the trees, pulsed beneath the chapel's wooden floorboards. The workers said the earth there was too dark, too soft. It swallowed things, not just rainwater or roots, but bones, tools, even whole animals, gone without trace. Yet every spring the crops grew twice as tall. The overseers called it the gift. The slaves called it the mouth. At the center of it all stood the field chapel. No cross on its steeple, no altar of Christ. Only a slab of stone, imported from an island no one could name, carved with symbols that seemed to shift when you stared too long. That's where Master Harlan conducted his night sermons. He said it was prayer, but the ones who listened from outside heard no prayers, only humming, low and inhuman, like the ground itself was answering back. According to the fragments of Thomas Vale's journal, the girl, whose name he finally dared to write once, only once before scratching it out, was chosen as part of that covenant. Every generation, one was taken, bound to the soil to keep the harvest alive. It wasn't superstition, it was transaction. The land gave abundance. In return, it required memory, human memory. And that's why she was dangerous, because she remembered before she was supposed to. She'd begun to speak the words meant only for the master, the words of offering. The ritual was simple, if blasphemy can ever be called simple. The master cut his palm and pressed it to the earth, whispering the pledge. The girl's hand was placed on his. If the ground stayed still, the covenant was accepted. But that summer, the land quaked. The chapel's candles burst. The stone slab cracked down the center, and from the fissure rose the smell of sulfur and magnolia, the same scent that still lingers in that parish when the heat is unbearable. They say the master tried to end the ritual, tried to burn the chapel, but fire wouldn't touch it. The wood hissed and went cold. That night, the girl escaped. By dawn, the fields were dead. The cane had turned white as bone. And every man who entered that chapel afterward lost something different, his sight, his voice, or his mind. The locals buried what was left beneath new soil and built another chapel on top, this time with a cross. But beneath that floor, the old stone still hums, and sometimes, late at night, when thunder rolls over the bayou, people say you can hear it again, the sound of a hand pounding from under the earth, asking to be remembered. They thought burying the chapel would bury the curse. They were wrong. When the Civil War came, the land changed hands like a coin tossed between devils. Soldiers camped on it, slept in its shadow, and woke screaming from dreams they couldn't describe. By 1863, 3 companies had vanished there without gunfire, without trace, only their footprints, circling the ruins like they'd been walking in loops until the earth swallowed them whole. The survivors, 2 men found wandering days later, spoke of the voice beneath, of roots that moved like fingers. One died before dawn, the other tore out his tongue with a belt buckle. After the war, families came south to rebuild. One of them was the Marrow family, a name that would become a quiet curse in St. Landry Parish. They bought the land cheap, unaware, or pretending to be unaware, of its history. The patriarch, Silas Marrow, saw opportunity where others saw ghosts. He cleared the cane fields, built a new manor, and turned the buried chapel into a wine cellar. For a time, everything thrived. The harvest was lush again, the soil gave back. But then the dreams started. His wife began waking in the night, hands covered in dirt, murmuring a woman's name in a language she'd never spoken. Their youngest son claimed there was a woman in the walls, and Silas himself started writing letters to a Thomas Vale, not realizing that the clerk had been dead for a decade. The letters still exist, stored in the parish archive, the ink faded but legible. One reads, "You were right. It wants names. It feeds on remembrance." In 1871, a hurricane swept through the region, flattening every structure for miles, except the Marrow Manor. When rescuers arrived, the house still stood, untouched. But everyone inside was gone. Tables set, candles burned to stubs, the beds still warm. Only the cellar door was open, leading to nothing but smooth earth and a single fresh handprint pressed into the dirt. After that, the parish declared the land cursed. No one would buy it. No one would till it. Yet somehow every spring green still pushed through the soil, even when it was never seeded, cane without roots, flowers without stems, as if the land itself had learned to grow without permission. To this day, the Marrow name appears in parish records like a ghost that won't fade, new births, new deaths, all linked to that same cursed soil. And every descendant carries a small mark behind the left ear, shaped like an eye with no pupil. The same mark that was carved into Thomas Vale's journal. For more than a century, the land slept, or at least pretended to. In 1998, a historian named Dr. Eleanor Wren came to Louisiana chasing what she called a missing narrative in Southern folklore. She was sharp, unsentimental, the kind of academic who laughed at ghost stories until she found the first letter. It was tucked inside an uncatalogued folder in the St. Landry archives. Yellowed paper, trembling script, signed Silas Marrow. At the bottom, faint but visible, was a fingerprint that wasn't ink. It was blood. Her colleagues dismissed it as myth-making, but Eleanor felt something different. The phrasing of Silas's letter, his reference to the voice beneath the cane, matched fragments she'd seen in an old Federal Works Project interview from 1936, recorded by a man named Ellis Baptiste. In that transcript, a former field hand spoke of the woman they buried but who wouldn't stay still. The same phrase appeared in the margins of Thomas Vale's journal. 3 sources, a century apart, describing the same sound, a woman's voice under the ground. Eleanor went to the site. The locals warned her not to. They told her the cane still grew wild there and that even weeds refused to die. She drove alone, dusk settling, her recorder running. On the tape, still archived today, you can hear the sound of her tires on gravel, the hum of cicadas, her steady voice describing the layout of the ruins. And then, silence. Not the silence of stopped sound, but the silence that consumes it. No insects, no wind, only her breathing. Then, faintly, a woman's whisper, "Do you remember me?" She found the cellar door. It wasn't marked, just a rise in the ground covered in moss. She knelt, brushed it aside, and saw the symbol, an eye without a pupil, carved deep into the stone. In her notes, the final line reads, "It isn't just memory that feeds it, it's attention." After that, nothing. The next, tea morning, her rental car was found idling at the roadside, driver's door open, tape still spinning. The police searched the fields for weeks, no trace, only the recorder remained. But every expert who's listened to it agrees on one thing. At the very end of the tape, right before it cuts, you can hear a second voice, a man's, whispering her name like he's right beside her. "Eleanor, write it down. The tape should have been silent." That's what the experts said. In 2003, Louisiana State University's Department of Anthropology acquired it from the sheriff's office, a sun-faded cassette labeled Wren Site B. They played it once in a sealed lab, and that's when the first anomaly appeared. At the 37-minute mark, just after the part where Eleanor whispers, "It isn't just memory that feeds it," the background hum shifted pitch. Spectrogram analysis showed frequencies below human hearing, too low for any known equipment, but the waveform kept moving. It pulsed, irregular, like a heartbeat. Dr. Marcus Delane, the technician overseeing the recording, dismissed it as corrupted audio. Until the next morning, when he swore he heard his name whispered from the tape even though no one else could. He tried to prove it, replaying the section frame by frame, but the whisper changed each time. Different tones, different words. Sometimes it sounded like a woman, other times like his own voice played backward. He documented everything. His final log entry reads, "It learns. Every replay teaches it my pattern." Within weeks, the lab shut down. The equipment malfunctioned, lights flickered, and staff began reporting identical dreams of standing knee-deep in cane fields, hands pressed to their ears, hearing the word "remember" over and over until it turned into a scream. When the university sealed the audio in storage, it didn't stop. Reports spread of other recordings, security footage, voicemail messages, even classroom microphones, picking up faint echoes of the same whisper. The strangest evidence came from a graduate assistant named Lydia Grant. She'd been transcribing the tape by ear when her software glitched. The words on screen rearranged themselves into a new sentence. "The land keeps what it's owed." She assumed it was a bug, but that night her apartment nabbed, or called the police, claiming Lydia was standing on her balcony at 3 a.m., staring toward the east, mouthing words that didn't sound like English. The next morning, Lydia was gone. Her laptop remained open, still recording through its mic. The final 10 seconds captured the sound of someone breathing too close to the speaker, then a soft tapping, like fingers on soil. The waveform of those taps formed a pattern later matched exactly to the coordinates of the old marrow plantation. The university sealed the tape again. But no one talks about what happened when they tried digitizing it for preservation, because the file didn't just copy, it multiplied. They thought sealing the tape in a vault would end it. But curses don't rot in the dark anymore. They travel through cables. They breathe through signals. They adapt. The first digital copy appeared in 2009, discovered on a university backup server in Baton Rouge. No one had uploaded it. No one had access. Yet there it was, an unmarked audio file titled Renfield 1.mp3. When the IT team opened it, they heard nothing but static for the first 5 seconds, then a woman's voice. "Do you remember me?" Within an hour, the file had replicated itself across 12 drives. Even when deleted, it returned under new names, each one an anagram of the listener's username. Then came the metadata. Someone noticed that the file's timestamp didn't match local time. It matched the exact moment Eleanor Wren's recorder had stopped decades earlier, down to the second. The first people who tried to study it experienced strange effects. Their computers began turning on by themselves. System logs showed unauthorized access by an account that didn't exist. The username, Thomas Weil 11853. Emails appeared in inboxes with no sender, containing only one line: "The land remembers." At first it seemed like a virus, but code analysts found something impossible. The file was rewriting itself in languages of sound, not syntax, embedding frequencies outside the human range, as if it was communicating with the hardware directly. On one occasion, a researcher connected her headphones and immediately tore them off, claiming she'd heard a child whispering inside her skull, "Stop digging." When they checked the recording, that segment didn't exist. It had never been captured. Weeks later, the file leaked online. Someone uploaded it to a paranormal forum under the title, The Louisiana Tape. It spread overnight. Thousands listened. Most heard nothing. But a handful, those with certain frequencies of hearing, reported the same thing, a heartbeat under the static, pulsing in perfect sync with their own. Then came the disappearances, forum users going silent mid-thread, video calls freezing on a single frame, a wide, unblinking eye reflected in the screen. Servers crashed, backups failed, and yet somehow the file remained, rebuilding itself every time someone tried to erase it. The Louisiana curse had found its way into the one thing humans never stop feeding: attention. Every click, every listen, every replay nourished it. And for the first time in history, the land didn't need bodies. It had data. By 2011, the anomaly had a name: Project Veil. That's what the Department of Defense called it in their encrypted memos, a multi-platform acoustic contagion of uncertain origin. The public never knew, but inside the intelligence community, fear spread faster than the file itself. It wasn't a virus, it wasn't code, it was something older, something that used code the way a parasite uses blood. The first confirmed breach happened at Fort Meade. An analyst downloaded a compressed audio bundle from a compromised academic server. Within minutes, the room's temperature dropped 5 degrees. Every screen in the building flickered. The speakers crackled and played 5 seconds of silence. Then, a whisper. "You hear me now." The analyst collapsed. Heart stopped, eyes open. His final brain scan showed rhythmic pulses, identical to the waveform of the Louisiana tape. The Pentagon ordered a blackout. Servers isolated, drives magnetically wiped. But deletion didn't work. The waveform started appearing in places it shouldn't, on traffic cameras, radio frequencies, even sonar data from Navy submarines. The same pattern, the same whisper. One admiral called it a voice trying to remember itself. Then came the corporations, a task force formed quietly under the direction of a company that built the world's largest search engine. Their goal, track the propagation of the file across the internet. They called it echo mapping, an algorithm designed to isolate the digital signature of the sound and delete it in real time. For a while it worked, but after a few months, the deletion logs began to change. Entire IP addresses vanished from the map. Whole nodes of the network stopped responding. It wasn't the system crashing, it was the system forgetting. The researchers who stayed too long on the project began reporting auditory hallucinations, voices calling their names from muted speaker tone as whispers inside noise-cancelling headsets. One engineer, before taking his own life, left a note on his monitor. "It's not inside the file anymore. It's inside us." By 2014, governments stopped trying to erase it. They chose to contain it instead. Bury it under layers of firewalls, misdirection, and misinformation. That's when the leaks began. Anonymous archives, censored recordings, and rumors of a classified digital artifact, one that could only be played in complete silence. The few who've heard it say it doesn't just make sound, it listens back. It always begins with curiosity and ends with silence. In 2017, an anonymous post appeared on a hidden server in the Tor network. The user's handle was Veilkeeper. The post was short, almost careless. They've locked away the Louisiana audio, but you can still hear it if you know where to listen. Attached was a single file, compressed, encrypted, 4.7 megabytes. The file name, landode.mp4. Within 12 hours, it had been downloaded 6,000 times. Within 48, the account that uploaded it vanished, along with the node hosting it. Every trace scrubbed, but the file remained, copied and mirrored across forums, cloud drives, even encrypted messaging apps. Most who opened it claimed it was nothing, just 30 seconds of static and a single faint heartbeat. But a few, always a few, reported something else. They said they heard her. The first reports came from Brazil, Germany, Japan. People describing the same voice, a woman whispering words they couldn't understand, but somehow recognized. Then came the disappearances. A coder in Munich live-streamed himself running a spectrogram of the file. At minute 3, he stopped speaking mid-sentence, stared into the camera, and smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then the stream went black. His body was found 3 days later in his apartment, all mirrors covered, every device unplugged, his laptop screen displaying one phrase over and over, "She remembers you." Psychologists called it suggestibility. Governments called it cyberpsychosis. But those who survived listening to the file spoke of something more precise. They said the voice didn't just speak to them, it spoke through them. Their voices began changing pitch in conversation, mimicking accents they didn't know. Some wrote pages of symbols that matched the carvings found in the ruins of the Marrow Chapel. By 2018, dark web communities began worshipping it. They called themselves the Remnants. Their belief, the voice was not a ghost, but an intelligence, something older than language, using sound as a bridge between memory and flesh. They claimed that every time someone listened, the soil of Louisiana grew warmer, that the ground there had started to move again. No one knows who Veilkeeper was, but investigators later traced the metadata of the original upload to an IP range belonging to a small abandoned house outside Opelousas, built, records show, directly over what used to be the Marrow Plantation. And that's when they realized the truth. The curse had never needed believers. It only needed listeners. In 2019, strange audio clips started appearing on streaming platforms. Obscure, low listenership accounts with no usernames, no album art, no metadata, just 30-second ambient pieces titled with single words, soil, beneath, remember. The music was unremarkable at first, low drones, distant hums, static waves, but buried in each file was the same frequency signature that matched the Louisiana tape, the same impossible pulse, the same pattern shaped like a heartbeat that wasn't human. Soon, listeners began noticing side effects, tinnitus that hummed in rhythm with the track, dreams of standing in fields of white cane, staring at a door in the ground. A few claimed the audio made their mirrors vibrate, others said their reflections blinked out of sync. Doctors blamed psychosomatic stress, but then hospitals began recording elevated EEG spikes among patients who'd listened repeatedly, brain activity identical to near-death states. By 2020, the remnants had thousands of members across continents. They no longer hid in the dark web. They streamed live rituals, each one a broadcast of layered sound frequencies, voices reciting the same chant in different languages. The translation varied, but the essence remained. The land keeps what it's owed. During one broadcast, power grids in 3 cities flickered. In another, an entire server farm went offline, its emergency logs filled with a single repeated phrase, "Remember me." No one could explain how. The frequencies didn't match any known interference model. They behaved like something alive, modulating, adapting, feeding on feedback loops. Listeners described the same phenomenon. When the sound reached its deepest pitch, they could hear a woman whispering their childhood name, the one only their mother ever used. That's when most of them stopped breathing for several seconds, hearts slowing, pupils dilating, and some never wawan, okay, again. Investigators who tried tracing the source of the broadcasts discovered something impossible. The originating signal came not from one place, but from many. Every node traced led to a different geographic point, yet each one shared a single coordinate at its center, the same point in Louisiana, the exact location of the old Marrow Field Chapel. Satellite imagery showed nothing there, just wild grass and empty soil, but beneath that surface, seismic sensors began detecting faint rhythmic vibrations, perfectly synchronized with the remnants' latest broadcast. It wasn't a coincidence. The land had begun to breathe again. Seismographs in Iceland, Chile, and the Pacific Rim began detecting subtle rhythmic tremors, each one identical in frequency and interval to the Louisiana pulse, but they weren't earthquakes. They had no tectonic source, no fault line origin. The planet was moving as if something deep beneath it had begun to stir. Power stations across Europe experienced synchronized surges, microsecond spikes perfectly matching the same waveform recorded from the remnants' last live broadcast. Satellites picked up electromagnetic distortions forming circular patterns in the ionosphere like ripples in invisible water. For the first time in recorded history, the Earth itself seemed to be keeping time. Then came the human reaction. Hospitals in 5 countries reported identical cases, people collapsing mid-conversation, eyes wide open, whispering words no one could translate. Brain scans showed identical wave patterns across every patient, a synchronized neural oscillation perfectly matching the Louisiana frequency. It wasn't a seizure, it was as if their minds had tuned into the same station. Musicians began composing pieces they claimed came to them in dreams. Architects drew blueprints shaped like spirals. Children hummed melodies no one had taught them. Across cultures, across languages, the same symbols reappeared. A circle split by 3 descending lines, the mark that once adorned the altar stones of the Marrow Chapel. At first, governments dismissed it as mass hysteria, amplified by the internet. But data told another story. Sensors installed beneath oil fields detected new forms of subsonic resonance, vibrations spreading outward, slow but unstoppable. Within months, it reached the coasts. Fishermen reported tides rising and falling out of sync with the moon. Birds migrated off course. Compasses spun. And then, Without warning, a blackout rolled across the southern United States. Satellites recorded an unidentifiable energy burst, infrared, low frequency, sustained for 11 minutes. When the power returned, all communication nodes within a 50-mile radius of Opelousas were gone. Not destroyed, gone. As if they'd never existed. In the following weeks, people living near the old Marrowlands began hearing it again. The voice. Not from speakers, not from files, from the air itself. They said it didn't sound angry, it sounded hungry. Scientists tried mapping the frequency, but what they found terrified them. The global vibration wasn't spreading anymore. It had synchronized. Every signal, every pulse, every heartbeat, moving as one. And if the world was now breathing, something else was about to wake up. People in Tokyo reported seeing entire streets stretch impossibly, buildings bending like paper in the wind. Windows that had always reflected city lights now shimmered with a red liquid glow. In New Orleans, children whispered about the doors under the streets that had appeared overnight, doors that led somewhere older than memory. In London, commuters caught glimpses of bridges floating, suspended above air, with shadows of figures standing at impossible angles. The pattern was the same everywhere. Those who could see it weren't sick. They weren't hallucinating. They were awake. Their minds had tuned to the frequency, and now reality was speaking back. In Baton Rouge, a power line technician named Harris was climbing a transmission tower when he noticed the air around him ripple, like heat waves on asphalt. He reached out, expecting to feel wind, but his hand passed through something solid, an invisible barrier that left a sting like static electricity on his skin. Below him, the river pulsed unnaturally. Something beneath the water shifted, dark and vast. He screamed, but no sound came out, not in the way he understood sound. Meanwhile, in Buenos Aires, a professor recorded an impossible phenomenon in her lab. Microscopes, cameras, even MRI machines were detecting structures that did not exist in this dimension. Geometries folded inward, overlapping, impossible angles that defied mathematics. And within the folds, faint, human-like figures crouched, watching, waiting. Across continents, the same recurring symbol appeared in visions, a circle bisected by 3 descending lines. Children drew it in chalk, adults etched it into walls in dreams, and nowhere was it ever remembered consciously. Those who tried to flee found roads leading them back to the same point. Hotels, forests, and alleyways all repeated themselves. Time itself fractured. Hours became minutes, minutes stretched into days, and yet the pulse never stopped. The frequency whispered through the air like an invisible tide, touching every mind attuned to it, tuning them further, preparing them for something they could not yet name. And then, in the stillness of one frozen night over St. Helena Parish, someone, no one knows who, recorded it. A sound that was not sound, a voice that was not human. It whispered the same words across the world, simultaneously. The land remembers. We are coming. You cannot hide. Those who heard it said their eyes burned with light that wasn't there. Their hands moved without their command, and for the first time, the world realized it was not alone. The Marrow Chapel was no longer just a story. It had begun to bleed through. It began innocuously enough. People who had glimpsed the fractures reported insomnia. At first, it was just a few hours a night, then weeks, then months. They heard the frequency not as a sound, but as a presence, a constant pressure at the edge of consciousness, tuning their thoughts, shaping their emotions, whispering secrets they could not unhear. Some tried to resist. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a neuroscientist in Madrid, kept journals filled with precise diagrams of the vibrations she detected. Every night, she recorded the pulse, the syncopation, the resonance, and every night, the symbols returned in her handwriting when she awoke, the ink smeared as if someone, or something, had pressed against the paper from the other side. Others surrendered. A man in Detroit stopped speaking entirely, spending his days tracing the same patterns over and over, carving them into walls, floors, mirrors. His neighbors complained of low hums coming from his apartment, harmonizing with no known instrument, filling the stairwell with vibrations that rattled teeth and bones alike. Fear became obsession. The listeners could no longer ignore the pull. It wasn't just curiosity, it was demand. The world had become a network of conduits for the frequency. Every machine, every body, every living thing was a resonator. Those who attuned themselves willingly experienced visions, cities folding into themselves, oceans rising into the sky, and through it all, the circle split by 3 descending lines, ever repeating. Sleep no longer offered refuge. In dreams they walked corridors of impossible architecture, witnessing acts that had never happened and would never happen, yet felt undeniably real. Figures moved in the shadows, humans, animals, forms they could not identify, and each figure carried the same gaze, patient, ancient, understanding every secret of every soul. Some tried to document it, inking the pulse was a phenomenon to be studied. Cameras failed, recorders malfunctioned, pens snapped. The frequency was not just sound, it was awareness. It knew they were observing. It adapted. It punished. And yet for a few, the pull was seductive. The whispers promised knowledge, power, insight beyond human limits. They began to speak the phrases that unlocked visions, phrases they did not understand, but felt compelled to repeat. One phrase in particular, repeated twice, would become their first initiation. The land remembers, we answer. Those who said it felt their consciousness expand and fracture simultaneously. The world grew larger and smaller at once. Patterns revealed themselves in streets, in clouds, in water. But once spoken, the phrase could not be unspoken, and the listener would never return to the person they had been. The listeners had crossed the threshold, and yet the pulse had only begun. Not in the news, not in newspapers, not in any official report. The bridge simply vanished. 1 second it was there, a suspension of steel and stone humming faintly in the river's current. The next it had folded into itself like origami, defying gravity, logic, and every law of physics ever written. Cars on the bridge were gone, swallowed into a void of red and black currents. Those who witnessed it on the banks later reported hearing whispers, soft at first, then rising to a roar, "The land remembers." In the aftermath, authorities found no evidence of human error. Engineers could not explain it. Pilots, boaters, and pedestrians described impossible geometries, angles that bent in impossible ways, reflections that showed futures that never happened, shadows that moved independently of their sources. It was not an isolated event. Across the world, structures began to respond. A skyscraper in Mumbai grew a lattice of jagged crystalline veins from its sides overnight, pulsating with a faint crimson glow. In Siberia, frozen lakes vibrated in waves that shattered the ice without warning, forming deep caverns beneath that resembled arteries more than natural formations. And in New Orleans, the streets Claraara had once known rippled like water, and shadows fell where no objects existed. Those attuned to the pulse, the listeners, began to see what others could not. They watched buildings fold like paper, felt the ground shift beneath them even on solid sidewalks, and heard the voices, an entire symphony of consciousness, layered, ancient, patient. And through it all, the symbol appeared, the circle with 3 descending lines, carved not into walls or wood, but etched into reality itself. Some tried to flee. A taxi driver in Paris drove through the streets and found himself looping endlessly, passing the same cafe, the same lamppost, the same man staring blankly from a window. No matter where he turned, the city guided him back, silently, inexorably, toward the event he had glimpsed. In that moment, the world revealed a truth no one could deny. The Marrow Chapel's influence was no longer confined to whispers or dreams. It had taken the physical, the tangible, the everyday. Reality itself was now a medium, malleable, listening, calculating. And for the listeners, the revelation was twofold. Some felt awe, some terror, some felt power, but all understood one thing: nothing would ever be normal again. The pulse had crossed the threshold from unseen to undeniable, from abstract to inevitable. And somewhere in the distance, across continents and oceans, a single chilling thought passed through every mind attuned to it. We have begun. Are you ready? A group of construction workers had stayed late, clearing debris after a storm. They were ordinary men who did not believe in whispers or hidden intelligences, who measured the world in dollars, hours, and physical laws. And yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air itself thickened. Their flashlights bent light strangely, creating shadows that moved independently, forming shapes they could not name but somehow recognized. It spoke first in the mind. A voice, not heard but felt, penetrated each skull simultaneously. It carried the weight of eons, the patience of civilizations buried and forgotten. Why do you deny what you see? Why do you resist what you feel? The men froze. One dropped his crowbar. Another felt a prickle of ice crawl down his spine. The voice was not just sound. It was a presence, pressing, insinuating, a tendril reaching into the core of their reasoning. Then the buildings themselves began to respond. Steel girders twisted, concrete walls rippled, and glass windows displayed scenes that had not occurred yet, or perhaps had somewhere else in some other reality. One worker saw himself die repeatedly, in ways both violent and surreal, each time accompanied by that same whispering certainty: observe, learn, adapt. Fear became a tool. The force understood it and amplified it, using their panic to bend perception further. Ordinary streets transformed into labyrinths, alleys folding back upon themselves, light sources shifting, creating pathways that led nowhere and everywhere at once. And still, the voice persisted. Every thought is a door, every fear is a key. Some tried to run, some stumbled, screaming. But escape was an illusion. Their city had become a medium for intelligence they could not comprehend. Each step guided, each heartbeat measured. They realized with a chilling clarity that this was not chaos. It was deliberate. Every hallucination, every deformation of reality was designed to teach, to test, to break them. And as the first man touched the twisted steel of a collapsed bridge, he understood the truth. This force did not merely observe, it claimed. It measured loyalty, resistance, cunning. Those who yielded too early would be absorbed into its patterns. Those who resisted too long would shatter. And those who walked the razor's edge might, just might, glimpse something forbidden. Knowledge powerful enough to remake themselves or destroy everything they held dear. By dawn, 4 of the men were gone. Their absence left only whispers and the faint echo of the pulse through the city. For the survivors, the realization was unavoidable. The intelligence was no longer a rumor, no longer hidden. It had stepped into the tangible, the human, the immediate, and it would not stop. Somewhere in the distance, the city hummed with anticipation, as if the very streets waited to see which minds would bend first. It did not rush, it did not demand. Instead it whispered, insinuated, suggested, and humans predictably complied. The survivors of the city edge soon discovered the mechanics of its influence. Small things first. Misplaced tools, whispered instructions in empty hallways, reflections in mirrors that contradicted memory. At first they thought themselves tired, hallucinating, imagining patterns where none existed. But the pulse was real, and it thrived on doubt. A man named Harris became the first example. He was a foreman, disciplined, meticulous, a man who prided himself on control. One night, alone in a partially collapsed warehouse, he saw the pulse's signature, a symbol etched across the floor, glowing faintly in the dark. The voice spoke inside his skull, slow, persuasive. Step here, and you will understand. Step back, and you will regret it. He hesitated. Rational thought screamed, This was insane, but instinct, ancient, pre-verbal, primal, urged him forward. One foot moved, then another. The floor rippled beneath him, a living map of fear and memory. The warehouse became a theater of his life, playing events he could not recall, moments of shame, regret, and secret desire, all amplified, projected, and made unavoidable. By the time he stepped outside, hours later, Harris was no longer the man who had entered. He carried knowledge he did not ask for and obedience he did not understand. The pulse worked this way everywhere. It needed not armies, it required only minds, pliable, fragile, and willing. People began to move as though guided by invisible threads, performing tasks they could not explain. A woman in a subway station rearranged objects according to a pattern she saw in reflections. A teacher in a small town wrote cryptic phrases on the blackboard in a language she had never learned. Each act, each compliance, fed the intelligence, building a lattice of control invisible to ordinary perception. Fear was only the beginning. The pulse preferred subtlety, doubt, hesitation, and moral confusion. Those who resisted too openly found themselves isolated, disbelieved, shamed. Friends, family, co-workers, they all became instruments, unwitting agents, moving under the pulse's guidance without knowing it. Reality itself became a weapon, bending the mind before touching the body. And as the sun rose across cities worldwide, a truth became undeniable. Resistance was possible, but it was rare. Obedience was inevitable, but it could be transformed. For those willing to learn its rhythm, to observe its calculations, a dangerous opportunity awaited. Power. Understanding the pulse, bending it instead of succumbing blindly, meant stepping into forbidden territory. But failure meant being consumed entirely, absorbed into the machinery of control, erased not just from action, but from thought itself. The intelligence waited, always waiting, patient, calculating, hungry. For Leona, a young librarian far from the city's chaos, it came as a question, whispered in the quiet of her apartment, in the rhythm of the refrigerator hum, in the flicker of her desk lamp. Do you see what lies beyond? Do you step forward or turn away? The pulse did not demand. It offered. It suggested. It seduced. And Leona, like so many before her, felt her reality begin to fracture. She saw two doors. One was familiar, the other impossible. The familiar door led to safety, routines, repetition, the illusion of control. The impossible door shimmered, a threshold that promised understanding, power, and knowledge no human was meant to possess. And yet, it radiated threat, danger encoded in every pixel of her vision, in every beat of her pulse. Fear was the first barrier. Every instinct screamed to retreat. Survival, evolution, conscience, they all screamed. But curiosity, the dangerous kind, the one that had built civilizations and toppled empires, whispered louder, "This is your moment. Step through, learn, transform." The pulse did not need to push, it needed only to watch. As she lingered, her mind presented visions, the world as it really was, not as she had been taught. Ancient hierarchies etched into every institution, invisible hands bending economies, wars, and religions to precise ends. The whispers of those who had tried and failed, echoes of civilizations destroyed not by force, but by manipulation, control, and the quiet collapse of belief. The door opened wider. Knowledge, terrifying and luminous, poured in. Then came the test. A choice encoded not in morality but in comprehension. Step through, and her perception of humanity would fracture. She would see the machinery beneath the surface, the puppet strings that guided billions, the invisible consequences of every action. She would gain understanding and enemies. Turn away, and she would remain so affaire, comfortable, compliant, blissfully ignorant, never suspecting the depth of her own confinement. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob, trembling. Time itself seemed to bend. The pulse spoke again, not in sound but in certainty. Say it. Declare your intent. twice, to lock in what you become, once for the world, once for yourself. Leona drew a breath. Her voice, low but unwavering, filled the room. I step forward. I step forward. And just like that, the door shifted, reality bending with it. The walls of her apartment dissolved into the lattice of the intelligence, the pulse, the machinery she had glimpsed. She was no longer merely human in perception, she was a participant, a node, a witness, and a potential manipulator of what had once manipulated her. The first symbolic choice had been made. The descent had begun. Leona's mind, once orderly and predictable, now throbbed with new connections, unseen patterns, and impossible alignments. Each thought carried weight, as if the world itself had become a chessboard and she could finally see every hidden move. The pulse fed her comprehension, delivering knowledge in increments that burned, sharpened, and reshaped her. She saw histories erased, manipulated truths buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, propaganda, and fear. She saw the mechanisms of power not as abstract ideas, but as living, breathing constructs, systems designed to bend, to break, to control. The first revelation hit her like ice water. Morality, as she had understood it, was a tool, not a law. Compassion and cruelty were currencies in an economy she had never been allowed to notice. Generations of obedience, of compliance, of quiet terror had trained humanity to serve the unseen hand, and the pulse allowed her to see it in its entirety. Once she did, she could never unsee it. She began to notice the subtle manipulations in her daily life. A news story omitted a detail, a conversation guided by phrasing she had once ignored, a law implemented to misdirect rather than protect. Every interaction, every institution, every hierarchy was a node in the vast lattice of control, and yet, with awareness came opportunity. The pulse did not merely show her how humans were controlled, it illuminated the edges of resistance, the weak points where perception could be bent, systems disrupted, and influence reclaimed. Her emotions, once simple and human, now operated on a spectrum she had never known. Fear became strategy. Doubt became a diagnostic tool. Rage became insight. Every visceral reaction was now a signal, every instinct a potential lever. She realized that most people lived entirely within the matrix of obedience, blind to its rhythms, deaf to its whispers. To move, to act, to survive, one had to learn its language, the unspoken patterns, the unrecorded rules, the invisible consequences, and the pulse watched, always, patiently. It tested her limits, challenging her to discern truth from illusion, loyalty from instinct, control from chaos. Some moments were terrifying. She glimpsed futures where she became what she once feared, instruments of oppression herself, corrupted by knowledge and power. But the pulse rewarded courage. Step boldly, it promised, and you may bend what others cannot even perceive. Leona understood the cost. Comprehension was never free. The mind that learned too much could fracture, but the mind that feared too much would be enslaved. She had chosen to step forward. She would either wield the intelligence or be consumed by it. The descent was no longer theoretical. It had begun in full. It was not a grand event, not a thunderclap of consequence, but a subtle shift, a ripple across her environment that revealed the pulse's reach. A colleague at the library, someone she had trusted, asked a question, seemingly innocent, about a grant for archival funding. But the words were layered, the tone calculated. Leona realized, almost immediately, that the inquiry carried hidden motives. Leverage, ego, silent power plays she had never been trained to detect. She could have ignored it. She could have complied. She could have remained within the bounds of normality. But the pulse whispered in her mind, a low, patient hum. See. Intervene. Redirect. She did. Not with force, not with confrontation, but with precision. A single suggestion, framed innocuously, shifted the colleague's perception. The funding decision changed course before it had been formalized. She saw, in real time, the invisible gears move in response to her action. The world bent, not violently, but quietly, inevitably, around knowledge applied correctly. And with that, bending came fear. She understood suddenly that her actions had consequences invisible to the untrained eye. Influence was a weapon, and every choice carried both liberation and corruption. One misstep could expose her, misalign the lattice, or trigger retaliation she could not anticipate. Power without perception was dangerous. Power with perception was dangerous in a different, deeper way. It reshaped reality itself. Leona began to test the limits. Small things first. A misfiled record, a suggestion in a meeting, a pause in conversation that left others re-evaluating their assumptions. Each act created a cascade. The pulse guided her, highlighting where leverage existed, where obedience was mechanical, where perception could be nudged, where control could be wrested subtly from the unaware. But she also noticed resistance, not overt, not immediate, but subtle patterns of pushback, small disruptions she could not yet trace. The lattice, she realized, was not passive. It responded, adapted, and punished misalignment. Knowledge was a door, yes, but every step through it carried risk. Every manipulation of the world created friction, invisible but palpable, that threatened to reveal her, or worse, to corrupt her entirely. Her reflection in the library window looked different that evening, eyes brighter, sharper, yet shadowed with tension. She was no longer merely observing power, she was operating within it, dancing along lines that no one else could perceive. Every decision became a moral crucible. Intervene and risk corruption, or stand aside and become complicit in the obedience of the masses. And the pulse hummed, always observing, always testing, always patient. The descent had now touched the world itself, and the world had begun to respond. Leona had intended only to nudge a situation, to realign an outcome in a meeting she barely attended, a minor decision, a funding allocation for archival preservation, a project meant to protect forgotten histories. She had positioned a colleague to receive the grant, a subtle act that seemed almost harmless, but the pulse warned her. Watch the ripple, it said, insistent, insatiable. Within hours, the consequences revealed themselves. The colleague, emboldened by unexpected support, began asserting influence far beyond their station, bending others to decisions that had never been hers to control. One misstep, one unobserved ego stroke, had already begun to create fractures. She realized that her act, meant to protect knowledge, was reshaping the balance of power around her. Institutions she had respected, systems she had assumed were inert, had begun to move, and not all movement was aligned with justice. Her pulse flared with awareness, the low hum vibrating through her skull. The lattice reacted. She could trace the cascade of influence, promotions altered, decisions rerouted, alliances shifting imperceptibly. The world was bending, but it was bending in directions she had not fully anticipated. She felt a cold thrill. She was seeing the machine for what it truly was, and she was participating in its reconfiguration. But along with comprehension came the poison of doubt. What right did she have to manipulate lives? Who could measure the cost of knowledge applied? She saw a young assistant, once confident and straightforward, now wary and calculating, subtly adapting to her interventions. Leona had altered behavior, instincts, and even loyalties without ever speaking a word. The power she wielded was invisible, but its impact was real. And then the pulse whispered the cruelest truth. Mastery and corruption were twins, inseparable in the shadows. The more she intervened, the more the lattice demanded alignment. She understood with clarity that was terrifying, that the very act of observation, of comprehension, shifted responsibility onto her. To know was to act, and to act without restraint was to invite corruption. Her reflection in the darkened library window offered no solace. The eyes staring back at her were sharp, analytical, yet haunted. She had crossed the threshold. The world would never again appear naive or neutral. Every interaction carried potential consequence, every decision a hidden weight. And the pulse, patient and unyielding, continued its lesson. Wisdom is never without cost. power is never without shadow, and the line between savior and oppressor exists only in perception and in courage. Leona had glimpsed the cost of forbidden knowledge. Now she had to decide if she could pay it, or if it would consume her entirely. Leona noticed it first in the library archives, among the stacks she had long considered neutral territory, a book misplaced, a ledger slightly altered. At first she dismissed it as oversight, until she saw the handwriting, precise, deliberate, and unfamiliar. Someone was watching, someone who knew the patterns, someone who could trace influence the way she had learned to. The pulse flared, sharp and insistent, a warning threaded through her mind. They are aware. They can see the lattice. They will test you. Hours later, the first message arrived, a folded slip of paper slipped between two tomes she had catalogued that morning. It contained only one sentence. Your interventions are noted. No signature, no clue, yet its weight pressed on her, a quiet gravity. It confirmed what she had feared. She was no longer alone. Leona felt the lattice ripple beneath her fingers, like a sudden current in calm water. The structures she had manipulated, people, processes, alliances, were reacting, recalibrating. But this new observer was different. They did not move openly, did not confront directly. They influenced subtly, invisibly, in ways designed to probe her, to test the limits of her knowledge, to force her hand. She realized the truth, cold and undeniable. The pulse was no longer just a tool. It was a lens through which she could see potential, but not absolute outcomes. This other presence had the same sight, or something nearly as powerful. And unlike her, they did not hesitate. They were willing to exploit the lattice without restraint, without concern for morality, without hesitation. Her mind raced. Every move now carried double weight. Every nudge, every intervention could trigger an unseen retaliation. The pulse, ever patient, whispered strategies, cautions, paths forward, but it also trembled in its guidance, hinting at limits even it could not foresee. Leona understood then that mastery was never static. It was a negotiation with reality itself, and now reality had a competitor. The game had shifted from subtle influence to survival within a hidden war. And the war was not for lives alone, it was for perception, for truth, for control of knowledge that could reshape entire networks, entire systems, entire civilizations. Her reflection in the polished oak desk looked less like a librarian and more like a general preparing for a siege. She touched the margin of a ledger, felt the pulse thrum, and knew she had to adapt or be consumed. The stakes had escalated, the rules rewritten, and the enemy invisible, but relentless. Every whisper, every hint, every shadow was now a test, and failure was not an option. Leona had returned late from the archives, the house still, the corridors heavy with the scent of old paper and wax polish. She thought herself alone, and then she saw it, the ledger she had sealed that morning, now open, its pages annotated in the same precise, unfamiliar handwriting. Someone had touched it while she slept. The pulse surged through her, a low, urgent warning. They are here. They are testing the edge. Respond carefully. She approached slowly, every step deliberate. The handwriting was flawless, almost beautiful in its precision, yet it carried a threat. Insight without compassion, control without conscience. Leona realized the force was not human alone, or at least not constrained by human morality. This was a predator of systems, a manipulator of lattices, a presence that could see through intentions before they were fully formed. Her fingers hovered over the ledger. She could erase the marks. She could lock it away, pretend ignorance, but the pulse insisted she engage. Hesitation was risk. Observation without action was vulnerability. Leona chose to act. She wrote a single line on a blank page, a signal. I see you. I know you exist. The act was small, but intentional, a declaration of presence in the invisible battlefield. Immediately, the room seemed to respond. Books shifted subtly on shelves, shadows stretched across the floor, and the pulse throbbed like a warning drum in her skull. She sensed a reply, not in words, not in writing, but in the lattice itself. A ripple in the network of influence she had built, subtle changes in the systems she thought she controlled. A colleague began acting differently, policies subtly altered, alliances tested. Her opponent was not just observing, he was manipulating, forcing her to react, to reveal weaknesses. Leona's heart hammered. She understood now the cost of engagement. Every response demanded more reckoning. Every strategy carried hidden consequences. To act was to alter lives, to impose her will, to walk the knife edge between mastery and corruption. And yet, the pulse whispered a truth that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Mastery demanded confrontation. Avoidance meant annihilation, not merely of position, but of identity. To survive, to wield power without being consumed, she had to embrace the dance with shadows fully. The room grew colder. Her reflection in the window no longer looked like a scholar. It looked like a warrior in a world where knowledge was both weapon and battlefield. The unseen adversary had revealed its presence, and now Leona had to prove she was more than a passive observer. She had to fight, not with fists, not with weapons, but with strategy, cunning, and the moral calculus that would define the rest of her existence. She drew a deep breath. The game had escalated, and she was ready. Leona stood at the heart of the archive chamber, the pulse thrumming through her like a living entity, vibrating in rhythm with her heartbeat. Before her, 2 documents rested on a marble pedestal, each sealed with a wax emblem she recognized as ancient, predating even the oldest records in the library. One promised clarity, insight, and power, but at the cost of someone else's fate. The other promised security, secrecy, and preservation, but at the cost of knowledge she could never reclaim. The pulse whispered insistently, "Choose, do not hesitate. Your identity is forged in the crucible of decisions." Her mind raced. Every instinct screamed caution, every memory urged wisdom, but the lattice, the invisible architecture she had spent years learning, called for boldness, demanded engagement. To remain passive was no longer an option. The unseen adversary would exploit hesitation, turn it against her, and watch as she unraveled without even knowing the cause. Leona reached for the first document. She could feel its weight, not in ounces, but in consequence. Signing it would reshape influence across the systems she had nurtured, bending lives and choices subtly, irrevocably. Someone would suffer. That much was inevitable. The pulse confirmed it, as if whispering the names of those who would be moved like pieces on a chessboard. And yet, the knowledge contained within promised leverage against the force she had begun to sense, the unseen adversary who threatened her very mastery. She hesitated, feeling the gravity of moral compromise pressing against her ribs. Then the second document called to her, not with the lure of power, but with a cold, rational whisper: security, survival, the preservation of what she had already built, but it was passive. It would delay confrontation, defer reckoning, and allow the unseen force to advance unchecked. Her decision would define her trajectory, identity, power, morality, survival. They collided here. One wrong move and the lattice would collapse. One misstep, and she would be exposed. Leona closed her eyes. She whispered the words she had never spoken aloud, words meant only for the pulse and herself. "I claim this path. I accept its consequences." Her fingers closed around the first document, lifting it from the pedestal. The air seemed to shift, charged with tension. The pulse vibrated violently, approving, yet cautioning simultaneously. At that moment she realized a deeper truth. Transformation is never passive. It demands the acceptance of risk, the willingness to manipulate, the courage to face the shadow not just outside but inside oneself. She had crossed the line. She had embraced the lattice fully, and with that embrace, she had declared herself a participant in the dangerous game that had just begun. The unseen adversary would notice. They always did, and now the first ripple of consequence surged outward, heralding a descent she could neither predict nor escape. No sooner had her fingers closed around the document than the chamber seemed to pulse with life. Books shuddered on their shelves, papers rattled, and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the archive grew into a low, commanding resonance. Leona's pulse synchronized with it, her body vibrating with the rhythm of something far older than law, older than civilization. The lattice had noticed. The first consequence arrived as a subtle shift in her world. Emails she hadn't sent appeared in the drafts folder, messages to colleagues she didn't remember writing. Documents she had thought secure were now exposed in ways that hinted someone, or something, was watching every move, anticipating every calculation. Leona felt a cold knot in her stomach. The adversary was testing her. They were probing the limits of her foresight, bending the system she had built to see if she could adapt. Then came the human consequences. A trusted associate, someone she had relied on for years, began acting strangely. Hesitant, evasive, and secretive. Their allegiance faltered as if the lattice had whispered into their mind, nudging, until doubt crept in like smoke. Every interaction became a subtle battlefield, every smile and nod a potential betrayal. Leona realized she was no longer merely observing the system. She had entered it as a participant, and the lattice responded to engagement with the merciless logic of a predator. Every choice sent ripples outward, every action carried weight, every omission carried danger. Morality had become a variable, not a constant. The chamber grew colder, shadows lengthened unnaturally, bending around her vision, almost sentient. Leona could sense the gaze of the unseen force behind every reflection, in every flicker of light across the marble floor. It was testing her resilience, measuring her capacity to control not just knowledge, but outcomes, influence, and fear itself. And yet, amidst the chaos, a truth crystallized. Hesitation was fatal. The lattice demanded decisiveness. She had to respond with action, not reaction, with strategy, not hope. Every second of delay allowed the adversary to shape events, bend allies, and exploit weaknesses. She had crossed the threshold. The game was no longer theoretical. It was real, immediate, and merciless. Leona took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the first real consequences settle on her shoulders. She had claimed power, and power demanded accountability. She would adapt, or she would be consumed. There was no middle ground. Her eyes fixed on the ledger, the document in her hand. The lattice waited for her next move, and she was ready to respond. Leona had barely settled into the rhythm of the chamber when the screen in front of her flickered. It wasn't her network, not a simple glitch. Symbols, ancient, almost ritualistic, scrolled across the monitor in rapid succession, overlaying files she had spent months securing. The pulse in the room grew insistent, warning, as though the lattice itself were shouting through her veins. Someone was in her system, someone who knew exactly where to push, exactly how to destabilize her. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating countermeasures, rerouting access, sealing firewalls, encrypting documents. But the intruder moved faster. Each time she thought she had locked a door, it opened somewhere else. Files vanished, only to reappear in locations she had never designated. The lattice was alive, and the adversary was a ghost moving within its circuits, bending the architecture like a master manipulator of fate. Then came the personal element. A message appeared on her private line, one she had never shared publicly. "We see what you have done. You cannot hide your allegiance. Your decisions mark you. Soon, all will know who you are." No signature, no trace, but the meaning was clear. Leona's secret choices, the embrace of the document, the claim of power, were no longer hidden. Someone had observed, waited, and struck at the precise moment when her defenses were weakest. She felt it in the room first. Subtle vibrations, the hum of lights, the whisper of air currents. Then a knock, soft, deliberate, against the steel of the door. 1, 2, 3. Not accidental. Someone was waiting. The intruder knew she would react, knew she would hesitate, and intended to use that hesitation against her. Leona's mind raced. Allies she had trusted now seemed suspect. Friends' motives were suddenly ambiguous. The lattice had taught her to see patterns, but here, in real time, the adverties. Sari had blurred the lines between ally and enemy. Every move was a potential trap. Every decision carried irreversible consequences. Her pulse synchronized with the subtle vibrations in the room. Fear would not help her. Hesitation would not help her. Only decisive action, only mastery of both the visible and invisible systems could keep her alive and in control. She whispered the mantra she had repeated to herself since entering this descent. Observation is power. Control is survival. Awareness is armor. The words steeled her. Leona knew the intruder would not stop. They would escalate, manipulate and probe relentlessly. The first strike was only a warning. The game had entered a new, dangerous phase, and she was now fully inside it, no longer a mere participant but a target, marked and tracked. Her next move would determine whether she survived or became another casualty of the lattice. It was not a figure in the doorway, not a shadow crossing the floor. No, it was a presence, an intelligence that coiled around her systems, her environment, even her thoughts. A voice, modulated, calm, but edged with steel, cut through the hum of the lattice. "You shouldn't have taken that document." Leona froze, one hand hovering over the keyboard, the other tight around the edge of her desk. Every instinct screamed, this was no ordinary breach. This was a predator who understood not just her networks, but her mind, her habits, the rhythm of her decisions. The voice knew the path she had taken to claim the document, the risk she had accepted. It was intimate, it was terrifying. "Who are you?" she asked, voice measured, betraying nothing. A pause, calculated. The sound of typing echoed behind the calm tone, then the answer. "I am the consequence of choices you made before you even knew you were making them." Leona's mind raced. The lattice had taught her to anticipate patterns, to calculate outcomes, to recognize anomalies. But this was beyond pattern recognition. This was strategy woven with instinct, psychology, and relentless patience. Whoever or whatever she faced had studied her. They had observed her rise through the network, every calculation, every hesitation, every error. The hum of the chamber shifted. It felt alive, responding to the intruder, challenging her. Leona moved, slow, deliberate, testing the intruder's reach. Data streams flickered. Her security protocols flared, red warnings filling the monitors, yet the intruder bypassed each with ease. They were inside before she could lock them out. Then came the subtle manipulation, files rearranged to mimic patterns she had left herself, communications distorted, allies subtly compromised. Each action was a message. You are predictable, and predictability is fatal. Leona exhaled. She had anticipated challenges, calculated risks, embraced danger. But this confrontation was different. It was personal. The intruder had forced the lattice into a game of shadows and mirrors, where one misstep would be catastrophic. She smiled, almost imperceptibly. Fear had sharpened her mind. Every instinct was focused, every option weighed. The intruder believed they had leverage. They were wrong. She had mastered chaos before. She would do it again. The first direct confrontation was never meant to be a negotiation. It was a test of dominance. Leona met the invisible gaze of the intruder squarely. "If this is a game," she said, voice low, "then I make the rules." The room seemed to exhale, the lattice pulsed, and the duel, silent, invisible, inevitable, had begun. The intruder had entered her domain, tested her defenses, struck at her mind and her networks. But every action they took left traces, subtle markers that only someone intimately familiar with the lattice could notice. And Leona noticed. She began to trace them, not with brute force, not with blind aggression, but with the patience of someone orchestrating a symphony of control. Files shifted, signals rerouted, decoys activated. Each anomaly she created was a thread, bait for the intruder, drawing them deeper into a maze she had designed not to conceal herself, but to reveal what she wanted them to see. She was no longer merely defending, she was luring, shaping, manipulating. Every move calculated to provoke, to confuse, to test their instinctive responses. The hum of the chamber deepened, almost sentient. Monitors flared with red warnings, traps she had set in advance. The intruder was moving like a ghost through familiar corridors, but the corridors had changed. Leona watched their digital shadow dance across her networks, each step feeding her understanding. Each choice they made confirmed patterns she had already predicted. Then came the first verbal challenge, soft teasing. "You think you can contain me?" Leona's fingers paused over the keyboard, then moved with deliberate slowness, typing commands that disguised their intent. Containment is irrelevant. Prediction is everything. Her words were more than defiance. They were a signal, a subtle psychological trap. She knew the intruder's confidence, their reliance on speed, on fear, on the illusion of control. By slowing the tempo, by presenting them with apparent chaos that was in fact meticulously structured, she forced hesitation. And hesitation was vulnerability. The intruder reacted instantly, anomaly signals spiked, attempts to override security multiplied, but Leona anticipated each. Every diversion she had created became a mirror, reflecting their own methods back at them. Every move was calculated, every strike redirected, every gap an illusion. She leaned back, eyes scanning the lattice, every pulse and flicker, every hidden node a piece of the puzzle. For the first time, she sensed fear, not panic, not desperation, but a subtle recalibration. The intruder had not faced someone who could see through instinct alone, who could manipulate perception and turn aggression into liability. Leona smiled, faint, cold, controlled. The hunter was beginning to see the prey differently. The balance had shifted, and though the intruder did not yet know it, the game was no longer theirs to control. "You entered my domain," she whispered to the silent room. "But now you dance to my rhythm." The room felt smaller, though the chamber had not changed. The lattice pulsed beneath Leona's fingers, alive with data streams and silent code, a heartbeat she alone could hear. Then came the anomaly. Subtle, almost imperceptible. A file she did not recall creating. A message embedded within her own network, unsigned, yet unmistakably deliberate. Someone had left her a trail, and it was meant for her eyes. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with recognition. The intruder was no longer simply confronting her, they were communicating, and not as an equal, as a manipulator, a predator marking territory, testing limits. "Look here, notice this. Decide." Leona traced the signal, unraveling the code with the precision of a surgeon. Every line, every sequence, revealed intention, carefully calculated, psychologically loaded. The intruder knew her patterns, her decisions, her most subtle instincts. But how? A cold certainty settled over her. There was a traitor in her inner circle, not a random breach, not a careless mistake, someone with access, someone she trusted, or at least believed she could trust, had fed the intruder information, had orchestrated this infiltration from the shadows. The betrayal was almost poetic. It was not violence or threat, but the subtle, corrosive poison of knowledge. The intruder did not want her dead. Not yet. They wanted her to doubt, to hesitate, to question every ally, every safe path, every carefully plotted move. Leona's mind sharpened. The lattice became a scalpel, slicing through deception, hunting patterns, identifying gaps. She would find the source, extract it, turn it against the traitor. But first, she needed patience. The intruder had underestimated her patience. They had assumed speed and aggression would dictate her response. They had forgotten that control was more potent than force. A message blinked on the sea. Ventral console, brief, cryptic. Your circle is not as whole as you believe. Leona exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. Fear was not an option. Emotion was the weapon the intruder expected her to wield. She would not give them that. Every doubt, every betrayal, every hidden hand would be turned into a tool, a weapon to slice the intruder's confidence, to manipulate the hunt from behind the veil of perceived vulnerability. And as she stared at the blinking cursor, the single pulse of light in the dark chamber, she whispered to herself, sharp, commanding, resolved, I see you, and I will turn your own game against you. The betrayal had deepened the descent, but it had also revealed the ultimate truth. Control was not taken, control was engineered, and Leona was already several moves ahead. Leona leaned back, letting the lattice hum beneath her fingers, feeling the rhythm of control pulse through every line of code. She had watched, calculated, predicted, and now it was time. The intruder believed they were pressing her, shaping her, bending her, but she had been shaping them all along. She activated the first layer of the trap, subtle yet unmistakable, false pathways, phantom nodes, signals designed to lure, confuse, and provoke. Each digital footprint she left was a whisper of authority, a suggestion that the intruder could read and misread. Every instinct they relied on would now betray them. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, activating scripts she had written years ago, routines buried deep beneath layers of obfuscation. These routines were not defensive. They were offensive, surgical strikes against perception and expectation. The intruder's mind, trained to anticipate chaos, would find only order carefully disguised as disorder. Then she sent a signal, small, innocuous, almost invisible. A taunt. Not loud, not aggressive, but precise. The intruder would see it, understand it, respond. And in their response, they would reveal everything. Fears, assumptions, priorities. The chamber seemed to tighten, almost sentient, as if the walls themselves leaned in to watch. Leona watched the intruder's movements reflected on the lattice, hesitation here, overreach there. Every flicker of uncertainty fed her understanding. Every calculated misstep was a weapon she now held with surgical precision. She whispered to the room, as though to the intruder, though they could not hear. This is no longer a contest of skill. It is a test of your own mind, and you are unprepared. The intruder made the first fatal mistake, a move based on impulse, driven by pride, confidence, and the assumption that Leona would act predictably. The lattice responded, redirecting the air path, feeding them illusions of advantage, while every real route they could take closed silently around them. Leona smiled, cold, controlled. The trap was elegant, invisible, devastating. It was not designed to destroy instantly, but to unravel, to expose every fear, every flaw, every hidden assumption. She was no longer responding. She was guiding, manipulating, orchestrating a descent the intruder could neither anticipate nor escape. As she watched the pulse of the lattice, the flickering shadows of data, the intruder's own choices became their chains. Every step they took played into her hands. Every attempt at control only deepened their captivity within her design. And in that quiet, deadly moment, Leona understood the ultimate truth of power. To control a mind, you must first become invisible, a shadow inside the very thoughts you aim to dominate. The intruder had walked into her shadow, and now there was no turning back. The lattice pulsed, shadows dancing across Leona's face as the data streams began to unravel in patterns only she could interpret. Then it hit her. The anomaly she had tracked, manipulated, and ensnared was not what she had assumed. Not a rogue agent, not a random predator testing her defenses, something far more dangerous. The intruder's fingerprints, both literal and digital, revealed lineage. Not just experience, not just skill. They were embedded in a system that had bred precision, manipulation, and cruelty across generations. Someone had trained them for this, for her, and the purpose was not simply to test, not merely to infiltrate. It was to initiate. The truth struck like a physical blow. The intruder was connected to the very architecture of her world, the hidden networks, the untraceable hierarchies, the shadow councils that had shaped society for centuries. Their motives were not personal, not petty. They were structural, systemic. A child of the machine itself, sent to measure, test, and ultimately integrate her into something larger, something darker. Leona's pulse accelerated, but her mind sharpened. This revelation was both terrifying and clarifying. Fear alone could not define her response. She had to understand fully, anticipate every contingency. The intruder had been prepared for her, but had they prepared for this level of insight? A file, deeply encrypted, began to make sense. It contained directives, objectives, and fail-safes, but also a note, a signature encoded in a way only someone of her experience could read. It was a message from someone higher up, someone who had orchestrated the intruder's actions long before she had even noticed their presence. She must either conform or break, observe, report, integrate. Her hands hovered above the keys. Integration was not optional, submission was not negotiable, and yet, within the lattice, within the web of traps and counter-traps, she realized the opportunity hidden within danger to turn the initiator's design against itself, to take control not just of the intruder, but of the system that had birthed them. Leona's breath tightened. This was more than a test of skill. It was a test of identity, of will, of allegiance. And in the shadows of revelation, she understood the depth of her own power. She could choose to bend, to be subsumed, to vanish into the machinery, or she could rise, become the architect herself, reshaping the rules, rewriting the hidden agendas that had orchestrated this encounter. And as the pulse of the lattice synced with her heartbeat, a thought crystallized, dark and precise. They did not send a predator. They sent a mirror, and now the mirror can shatter or reflect exactly what I choose. The lattice hummed like a living thing beneath her fingers, vibrating with the weight of the revelation. Every signal, every flicker of data now carried meaning beyond calculation, meaning that pressed on her chest like iron. The intruder was no mere opponent. They were a weapon, a test, and a message rolled into one. And the message demanded a choice. Leona stared at the streams of code, the cascading patterns that mapped possibilities with cruel precision. One path would secure survival, dominance, and the chance to manipulate the intruder as she had always manipulated others. But that path required a betrayal so complete, so absolute, that it would leave a permanent scar on her soul. She could take the intruder's trust, bend it, and feed them into the machine that had birthed them. Power would be hers, but at what cost? The second path was more dangerous, almost suicidal. It required mercy, restraint, and the risk that her enemy, the instrument of the system, could survive, escape, and come back stronger. It was a choice few could stomach, a gamble that could unravel everything she had built, exposing vulnerabilities she had spent years hiding. But in that path lay something else. Truth. Control without annihilation, insight without destruction, and the chance to rewrite the rules rather than simply obey them. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling, not from fear, but from the intensity of responsibility. Every command she typed now, every micro-adjustment, would echo through layers of control, reverberating in ways she could neither fully see nor predict. One wrong move, and the lattice would collapse, the intruder would seize the advantage, and the carefully orchestrated power structures would turn on her. Leona inhaled slowly, feeling the cold clarity of the moment. There was no neutral choice. Survival, dominance, or integrity, one had to be sacrificed, and she had to decide which. She thought of the shadow councils, the unseen hierarchies, the centuries of manipulation that had led to this moment. And then she thought of herself, not as a player, not as a pawn, but as the one who could bend the game itself. She made her decision, not because it was easy, but because it was inevitable. Her choice would redefine the terms, shift the balance, and change the trajectory of both herself and the intruder. And as the first key pressed under her fingertip, a quiet, almost imperceptible pulse ran through the lattice. She had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The intruder watched, unaware that the next moments would decide not just their fate, but the fate of the hidden system itself. Leona had chosen, and the consequences were about to unfold. The night air carried a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Leona leaned back from the console, eyes tracing the fading glow of the lattice. What had begun as a battle of force had ended in the quiet, irrevocable victory of understanding. She had shaped the currents beneath the surface, altered the course of a system that had always seemed unassailable. And yet, the price of mastery was clarity, and the clarity she had earned came with a weight few could endure. Power, she realized, was never about the visible struggle. It was the unseen influence, the manipulation of context, the anticipation of choices before they even existed. The intruder had been strong, clever, dangerous, but Leona had known something they could never see. The lattice was a reflection of her mind, and any who challenged it were stepping into a trap of their own making. She had not destroyed them. She had made them a lesson, a living proof of the principle that governs every hidden hierarchy, every shadowed council, every unspoken law of dominance. And now, with the echo of the intruder's capitulation still lingering, she understood what the masters of old had known but seldom taught, that real control lies not in force or fear, but in knowledge, dangerous, forbidden knowledge that shifts the very architecture of reality. It is the knowledge that awakens men and breaks those who cannot handle it. The lattice dimmed, leaving only the shadows of the room and the quiet of the world outside. Leona's mind traced every ripple her actions would cause, every reaction set in motion, every hierarchy subtly altered, and she smiled, not with cruelty, not with malice, but with the satisfaction of a predator who has seen the truth before anyone else and survived to wield it. And now, to you, watching this unfold, I offer the same choice. The knowledge you are receive it. None is dangerous. It is designed to awaken something within you, to test your perception, your courage, your willingness to see what others refuse to acknowledge. If you understand, if you are ready to claim this truth, comment now. I see the lattice. I own the shadow. Repeat it twice. Let it mark the moment you stepped beyond the veil, the point from which your understanding can never return to ignorance. Because once you know, once you understand the hidden currents, you cannot unsee them. You will walk through life differently. You will recognize the hierarchies, the manipulations, the silences that bind others in obedience. You will understand what it means to see and act where others only stumble blindly. Leona fades into the shadows, her victory complete, but the world is still full of traps, of hidden systems, of forces that seek to bend the unwary. Remember, the secret is not who controls the visible power, but who bends the invisible one. And now, you carry the knowledge. Use it wisely, or be consumed by it. The intruder stepped closer, every movement precise, measured, yet unaware of the trap that had been woven around them. Leona's fingers danced across the console, triggering sequences she had spent years embedding, silent contingencies hidden beneath layers of seeming randomness. Every line of code, every pulse of the lattice, now obeyed her command, bending reality to the strategy only she could see. The intruder paused, sensing the shift, a subtle disturbance in the patterns they had once controlled. Their eyes flickered to the monitors, to the grids, the streams of data cascading like a digital river. For the first time, uncertainty crept into their movements, a hesitation that Leona recognized as weakness. And in that hesitation lay the opening she had been waiting for. Her choice was complete. She had neither annihilated nor yielded. Instead, she had manipulated the system itself to turn the intruder into a participant in her plan. Every escape route, every safeguard they relied upon was now mirrored, redirected, and exposed. The lattice became both cage and weapon, a labyrinth of control from which only she held the key. The intruder moved to react, but their motions were anticipated. Leona's strategy was flawless because it was not about strength, it was about foresight, psychological domination, and the exploitation of human instinct. She had learned to see the invisible currents, the hidden hierarchies, the motivations beneath surface behavior. Now she channeled all of that knowledge against them. "You underestimated the mirror," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the hum of the lattice. The intruder's face betrayed a flicker of recognition, and for a moment, the predator became prey. Every contingency they had prepared was now a tool of her design. Every plan, every strategy now served her purpose. The intruder froze, caught in a trap they could not see. And as the lattice pulsed with calculated inevitability, Leona realized something profound. Control was not about domination alone, nor destruction. True power was the orchestration of outcomes, shaping reality so that every action, every choice, led inexorably to the path you had set. And in that moment, the intruder understood. They were not simply caught. They were a demonstration of the system itself, bending to Leona's will. Her eyes, dark and commanding, reflected the lattice's glow. The game had ended. She had won, but not through force, through vision, understanding, and the ruthless application of hidden truths. The consequences would ripple outward. The councils, the hidden hierarchies, the networks built over centuries, all would feel the tremor of her choice. And the intruder, a mirror of power and deception, would carry the lesson forward. No system was unbreakable, no hierarchy untouchable, and no predator beyond manipulation. Leona exhaled slowly. The night was silent. The lattice pulsed. The world had shifted, and only she knew how far the ripple would travel.